The latest publication of Steve Hanke's Misery Index showed Cuba, the Caribbean island, in the first place of the list, following the socialist policies taken by the dictatorship of dictator Miguel-Diaz Canel, along with, of course, the economic crisis which was exacerbated by the COVID pandemic in the Caribbean island. This situation basically represents the latest example of how the Cuban Revolution has absolutely destroyed the Caribbean island, even when there are still many people around the world who keeps romanticizing the revolution of former authoritarian and former dictatorship Fidel Castro. So on the other hand, another pretty significant detail that this Steve Hanke's Misery Index showed was that Venezuela got to the second place after 5 years straight in the first place. Naturally, this is not a sign that, that Venezuela is somehow getting better. This is not a sign whatsoever. This is nothing more than the clear reflection that the Cuban situation is definitely going downhill. Definitely going downhill. Especially, as I previously said, because of the COVID pandemic, not only the communist policies in terms of economy, but also the COVID pandemic. So naturally, the cases of both nations, unfortunately, is not a surprise. It's not a surprise whatsoever, given the fact that we're talking about radical left-wing dictatorship that have applied an obsolete economic model. A pretty obsolete economic model, both in Venezuela and both in Cuba. As a matter of fact, the first one was the Soviet Union. What Cuba did was essentially to imitate the economic policies applied by the Soviet Union, by the extinct Soviet Union. And since the rise of former dictator Hugo Chavez in the late 90s, what Venezuela did was essentially to implement and imitate the policies of Cuba. So this is nothing more than a shame that has led to millions of people dead, and of course to some of the worst economic crises in the history of the world, in the history of humanity, in the history of Europe, in the case of the Soviet Union, and of course in the history of Latin America, in the cases of Caracas and of course Havana. So another pretty significant detail about this misery index was that the other Latin American nation that is on the first places of this list is Argentina, actually, which is currently in the 5th place because of their leftist policies and the way, of course, socialism happened in Cuba, the way the COVID pandemic has affected the economy. Nevertheless, as I said in a previous video on this channel, the thing with Argentina is essentially the fact that the governments that have been ruling Argentina over the last few decades have embraced protectionist and statist policies that have definitely destroyed the Argentinian economy, rising poverty and inequality. And as I said in the previous video, even the most recent right-wing administration of former president and current opposition leader of Argentina, Mauricio Macri, he didn't do anything to change this reality because of the political cost. So this is essentially the consequence, to see Argentina in the 5th place of the Misery Index, of Steve Hanke's Misery Index, in the first places, sharing the first places with countries such as Cuba and Venezuela. Reporting from Medellin, Colombia, Luis Orozco, Newsweek.